Slightly different format today. The feedback we had on the last few seminars was that one thing a lot of you would like was to have more input on what we're going to talk about. So we threw it open to people. Whose seminar is it anyway? It's of course yours, and so we're going to be touching upon some subjects that you have told us you'd like to hear us talk about. We are going to also, I'm afraid, talk about the R word. Is the R word recession? Is it redundancies? We shall see. Very briefly we're going to talk about that because we're positive modern employers. Our guest speaker today is Nick, who's going to just touch upon some immigration topics, and then we will be moving over to the section where we're going to be covering a whole range of issues that you wanted us to talk about. Now, since we last met, I think we've had 3 Prime Ministers, 4 Chancellors, 3 Justice Secretaries, maybe 4 Lord Chancellors. The good thing is, we're still here. There's a consistency, and you're all still here. It's a serious point though, because one of the challenges we face as employment lawyers, and you face whether you're HR practitioners or business owners, is trying to anticipate the direction of travel in the world of employment law, and that's quite difficult to predict when you don't know who's going to be in charge next week. And we'll touch upon that because it does present some real issues. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce this morning's guest speaker, who's going to come up and talk to you for a little bit about some immigration issues. Nick.
Good morning, everyone. It's a rather large photo of me as well. So, as Dan said, I'm going to talk to you all about business immigration and the ins and outs of hiring skilled labour from outside the UK. So, what is business immigration? Why is it important for you? Why should you be thinking about it in your businesses? Well, the first main reason why it's important to think about business immigration is, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, there are significant labour shortages in the UK at the moment. And principally, the main reason I would say is because of the end of freedom of movement. Brexit on the 31st of December 2020, it caused significant issues for businesses who used to be able to plug the gaps in their labour force with EU workers who could come and go as they pleased. And then, of course, you had the pandemic, which needs no introduction, and the linked increases in early retirement. So, with all of that said, many businesses will be looking abroad to recruit internationally because there's significant gaps in the UK labour market. And we've already seen this. The government have introduced temporary schemes. So, for anyone who may have seen, for HGV drivers and for those poultry workers as well, because they're very important in the run-up to Christmas. And they've also expanded the number of jobs on the shortage occupation list and the eligible occupation list. So the government is doing something, but the bottom line is that anyone who's not settled in the UK, which is anyone who's not a British citizen, who's not settled under the EU settlement scheme, or doesn't otherwise have a right of abode, they need a visa to be able to work in the UK now. So I'd like to be able to talk to you a bit more about the process, but I'm just going to give you an overview today and focus in on a couple of the more important parts of the actual process for recruiting overseas, and taking a look at the skilled worker visa route, which is probably the most used. So the first step is to make sure that you have a genuine vacancy. I think that probably goes without saying. You don't want to be manufacturing a vacancy because that could put you in breach of immigration law. You also then need to make sure that you obviously identify a suitable candidate. And there are a number of important considerations that you'll need to consider, obviously once you've interviewed and selected the right candidate. And then, if you haven't already, you'll need to obtain what's called a sponsor license, and that involves an application process, which I'll talk to you about today. Once you've gone through all of that, you'll need to speak to your friendly neighbourhood employment lawyers. So it's important then to be putting in place an offer letter, employment contract, and any sort of bespoke documents in case you pay immigration fees for the candidate and then want to claw that back. So you'll need to be thinking about that. Once you've made an offer of employment to the particular candidate, it will then be a case of assigning a certificate of sponsorship. That all sounds rather grand. It's not. It's simply a PDF document which sets out information about the individual and the role. They can then use this to make their skilled worker visa application. And then they'll attend a biometric appointment where they'll submit further details, their fingerprints, etc. If successful, you can employ them. But it doesn't end there. So once you've employed someone under a skilled work visa, you'll need to essentially make sure you comply with any duties that you have. There are a number of reporting duties, record-keeping duties that the Home Office will be checking that you comply with. And that's because the Home Office regards sponsorship as a privilege and not a right. So going into the role and the candidate a bit more, as I said, you can't have a manufactured reason, you can't bring over your friends just because you want to. So you need a genuine vacancy, and the Home Office will check for this. The role itself, it must be skilled to essentially A level. There are a number of eligible occupations which are set out online, and then you also need to make sure that you're paying a salary of at least $25,600 unless there is an exemption that applies. So an example would be for care workers who are currently on the shortage occupation list, and their salary is a minimum of $20,480, I believe. And then you would need to assign that rather jazzy PDF. So in terms of the candidate, they'll also need to satisfy a number of eligibility requirements in order to be successful in their visa application, and you should be checking this as well prior to going through this process to avoid any wasted costs. So they'll need to be able to speak, write and understand English it's essentially B1 level, doing an English language test, or otherwise having a degree that's taught in English. They'll also need to evidence £1,270 in savings. But if not, then you can agree to certify the maintenance to maintain it for the first month of employment. And they'll also need to not be a criminal. So, in terms of the actual process for becoming a sponsor, it's broadly split between an online application form and then submitting supporting documents. The online application form is intended to be user-friendly, however, it's a Home Office and a government system, so as you'd expect, it's not. But you'll need to then go about submitting the information about your business, registration requirements, why it is you should be granted a sponsor license to employ migrant workers, and then think about who within your business is going to be responsible for reporting to the Home Office on a day-to-day basis and have access to this sponsor management system. Who will be sort of the main contact with the Home Office day to day, and then you'll also need to think about sort of the coverage of your sponsor license. Is it going to be for all of the branches within your business or a specific office? The implications of that will become clear if you breach your duties as a sponsor, and then the Home Office come along and revoke your sponsor license. So those are all important things to consider when sort of going through that application form. Within 5 working days of clicking submit, you'll also need to provide a number of supporting documents. So sector-specific documents will be required. So if you're a CQC registered business, you'll need to prove your evidence of registration. There is a cost to going through all of this process, it must be said. So for small businesses, you'll need to pay a £536 application fee. Medium and large businesses, £1,476. That's really a statutory definition as to whether you qualify or not for that. And then the processing time is a standard 8 weeks. So that can potentially throw up issues if you've identified someone and you want to get them in quickly. We've seen it before where businesses don't have sponsor licenses in place, identify someone from abroad, it takes too long to get the sponsor license and they lose out on a very good candidate. So the way to fix that is to apply for a priority service, which comes at a cost, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. So, basically, is it worth it? Well, I think I'm biased because I'm talking about this today, but also I think there are a number of significant benefits to recruiting from abroad. As I highlighted originally, it's a potential solution to the difficulties that we're having in the labour market at the moment. You've also got a driven workforce with diverse ideas, and essentially it's skilled workers, it's skilled individuals if you can bring them across. There are a few drawbacks. The number of fees, it's more than just the sort of the application fee that I mentioned. There are visa fees that you also need to consider. Some of these are payable by the candidate, and you can recoup them if you want. So that's, I suppose, the counter to that. And it's also it's for skilled workers. This isn't really for low-skilled, low-paid workers. But that said, there is a minimum salary of $25,600. So if you're happy to pay that, then that's fine. But all in all, our advice would be to get in early and to look to take advantage of this method of recruitment. So yeah, that's me. Any other questions, do just come and find me at the end. Thank you.
Good morning. So as you can imagine, we had a bit of a rewrite this time last week when the bank announced, ever so cheerily, that we're entering the worst recession, as they are, not redundancies, recession in history, I think it is. So we thought it was only right that we just touch on it today. Obviously, I could talk about this for hours because I'm really tragic, but there's a lot to think about. This is just kind of an overview, and then obviously, I'll be swimming around at the end, and I suspect we'll be talking a lot more about this in the upcoming weeks and months. I guess for me and for the team here, the advice really is don't panic. I've had a lot of clients this week, as I'm sure we all have, call and say, I need to make redundancies, what am I going to do? I need to cut my workforce. Sometimes redundancies are the answer, and as the redundancy queen, I love doing them, but it's not necessarily the right thing to be doing right now. And what we've found in the past, and obviously Dan's been doing this a lot longer than me, is that the word recession can sometimes be a little bit self-fulfilling. Is that everybody panics, everybody cuts their staff, everybody stops spending money, and then it goes round and round and round. So in this room, we're going to just make that not happen, essentially. And it's just think, the obvious knee-jerk is fire everyone with under 2 years service. Please don't do that. It's not a particularly clever way to run your business, I would say, because you're potentially getting rid of a lot of talent, and then in 2 years' time, or whenever it might be, you'll realise you've got a lot of old people who may or may not be particularly good. They might be young, long-serving people, and you've cut all of your talent. So just think about it. Also, I'd say the thing to remember this time round is this is not COVID. So when COVID hit, you could kind of do what you want. Like, we all sat there and people were saying, well, can we send people home, what should we be doing? And we're a bit like, it's a pandemic, you kind of get away with it. This time you've got time to stop and think and plan it out. And again, staff potentially going to be a little bit more desperate this time around, particularly cost of living. They can't afford their cheese, their broccoli, their eggs, whatever it might be. They might be more inclined to sue you, which is why you've got to do it right. So these are the things that I would say you just need to think about, get ahead before you do the dreaded bad R word. So there's lots of things. Probably the biggest here is think about now whether you can change the terms of some of your staff. Essentially, it's not very modern. Get them to do the same amount of work for a little bit less money. That's always a good thing. So there's a lot of things you could do. You could think about cutting people's hours slightly. Obviously, if you reduce people's hours, you could reduce their pay. You could just reduce their pay, but it's not hugely attractive. People don't tend to agree to that, unless the carrot is, unless everybody reduces their pay, some of you are out of a job. Again, not a particularly positive message to send. I'm not sure it's one we want to be sending right now. Think about whether you can shift people's role functions. So it might be that you can flex what people do to get a little bit more out of them. And it might not even be that you want to do that now. It might be thinking future-proofing your business for 6 months' time. If you do have to make cuts and you do have to, cut people's hours or make redundancies if it's come to that, you need a flexible enough workforce left behind so that your business is still going to run. So think about things that you can be doing now to make sure that that still happens if everything goes horribly wrong. Equally, slightly controversially, quite a good excuse to be calling people back into the office. So if you are struggling getting people back in from home after the pandemic, this could be the excuse you need, ready to take it. And also in change the terms, think about if you are taking people on, think about considering the terms on which you are taking them on. So I know 0 hours is a dirty word. It's not that dirty, and actually right now it could be really helpful. If you're not entirely sure what your business is going to be, you're not sure whether your business level is going to go up and down, a flexible workforce or a 0 hours workforce could really work for you because it means you can much more easily flex up and down the labour that you need. Goes without saying, if you're going to change any terms of your current staff, you need to have a business reason for it, not just this is a lovely excuse to save cash, so you need to be able to show, get some management speaking, we're going to realise some efficiencies, this is going to make us more streamlined, get a business case together, and then you need to consult with your staff about those changes. You can't simply, no matter what your contract says, you can't just force those through, you've got to speak to your staff. And obviously your friendly neighbourhood lawyers can help you with that. Freezes, a really obvious one, pay freezes, recruitment freezes. If you've got the right to potentially suspend bonuses, think about doing that. Again, with your modern employer hat on, don't just do it. Whilst you can, just say we're not going to give anyone a pay increase and we're not going to hire anyone. It's a much better taste in your staff's mouth generally if you explain why. In my experience, staff fight or leave when they think they're being tricked or backed into a corner. So don't make them feel like that. Just feel like they're involved. We're all on this journey together. Times are tough for businesses, times are tough for you at home. So let's work out a way to fix it. And it's trying, as much as you can, to frame that in a kind of positive way. And that really feeds into that retention of talent point. Because again, what you don't want is to be left with a load of people who actually are your sort of bottom performers, the people you don't really like, and all of your top performers have swanned off somewhere else. So to the extent that you can, think about ways that you can keep those people happy. So is it just as simple as sitting down with them, reassuring them, telling them that the business is not, it's highly unlikely going to go pop, everything's going to be fine, you don't see at this minute there's any need to make redundancies, so stay with us. Again, think about non-financial rewards. Cash is tight for anyone, but could you say, look, in the future, we want to send you on a training course in the future. Think about in-house training you can do. Can you upskill them in-house to make them feel like they're still loved, but they're still on a progression path? Maybe get them to do more money, do more things without giving them more money on the promise of, look, this is your road to progression because you're one of our key people and we want to keep you. Again, any other non-financial things? Might want to throw them a couple of extra days holiday for a year if you've really got nothing to do. But it's just kind of thinking about ways that you can keep them happy. Private furlough. This is a bit of a curveball, I'm not going to lie, but some of our businesses did think about it with the C word, not that one. Is lots of businesses come Christmas might find that they just don't need staff, particularly in the hospitality industry. They will also think, again, they want to retain those staff on their books in some way. So some businesses, we saw last time around, almost agree, I said private furlough, so they will pay essentially a nominal salary to particular staff. They can stay at home, get their furlough towns, but stay on the books and come back. It's probably not for everybody, but something to think about. Swinging back round to the more negative side of that spider chart, layoffs. Layoff or short-term working, so that is temporarily sending people home without pay or shortening their hours. You have to pay them, and I have to write this down because it's so low, it's embarrassing, a guarantee payment of £31 a day when they're laid off, but that only lasts for 5 days, so it's only going to cost you £155. Technically, you need a contractual right to lay people off or send them on short-term working. Again, in COVID, everyone kind of did it. It is less likely that you'll get away with it this time around without having that clause. So if you're thinking that you need to just cut your workforce for a short period of time, flick to your contracts first, please, and give us a call if you're not sure, and we'll tell you whether or not you can do it. The other thing to remember when you lay people off is if you've laid them off for more than 4 weeks, they've got a right to apply to be made redundant. So if you're thinking about that, I would do some clever business planning in the background, because it might be possible to jig it around so that you can avoid them having the right to ask to be made redundant. Because presumably if you're laying people off, it's not because you want to make redundancies and pay all of the costs in doing that. And I said I could literally talk for hours about redundancy, so I'm not going to. But obviously if you did need any help, then give us a call. And I guess with all of that, the thing to consider is how you're going to select the staff that any of those things apply to. And the key is to think about it and not just say, well, I didn't like that person, she turned up late the other day and that was annoying. You've got to be able to objectively justify why you're doing what you're doing, and you'll all be so sick of hearing that for me. That's always the first question, it's always the why. But that's what it comes down to. One, legally, because you need a why, but two, again, in terms of keeping the staff that you have got happy, you all know how hard it is to recruit talent and retain talent. The ones that you want to keep, you want to make sure you can. And then if you're explaining to them why you're doing what we're doing and why particular people are having particular things happen to them, it's a much easier pill to swallow. So that is a very, very brief run through, but obviously any questions, I'll be milling around with Kathleen at the end. So
My job is to lift the mood from the R word. So, as I said at the beginning, we had lots of feedback that people wanted to ask us to cover certain topics, so we're going to be a bit brave. We've had a number of people sort of submit questions or themes that they would like us to talk about, and I'm going to let you pick. So we're going to have a time for you to shout out a bit. So on this next slide, these are some hints at the themes that people wanted us to talk about. And in the time that we've got, we'll cover as many as we can. We might not cover all of them. So anyone want to shout out which one of those bubbles they would like us to cover first? Oh, really? Okay, well, this is me. I'm going to be asking some of the team to answer all of these, but I fear none of you want to do IR35. So, I'm a bit geek. I love IR35, so if anyone wants to talk to me about it afterwards, then please do. But the position has changed many times. Most of you may know that IR35 is something that has existed in the public sector for many, many years. it didn't apply to the private sector, so it was largely ignored and most people didn't really understand what it was. From April 2020, it was supposed to apply to the private sector. However, COVID then kicked it back and it was delayed to April 2021. And it applies from April 2021 in the private sector to all businesses unless you are a small company. The definition is there. Again, it's a very legal definition. A few weeks ago, people got very excited because the then Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, announced in the mini-budget that in fact he was scrapping this and that from April 23 it would be abolished for the private sector. So we had lots of clients get very, very excited about that. And one client in particular made some sort of quite significant plans based upon it. But I think that position lasted about 3 weeks. And Jeremy Hunt then said, no, we're not abolishing it. And so in fact it is still here. And if you are in the private sector, it applies. And as far as we're aware, will continue to apply. What is it? In very simple terms, it's misunderstood, but it's just HMRC saying, if you employ somebody, you must tax them as an employee. We're not going to let you take on contractors and pretend that they are self-employed, because that means you as an employer don't deduct pay as you earn, you don't deduct national insurance, and we don't fully trust all of these self-employed people to fill in tax assessments honestly and accurately. And we think we're losing out. And that's what HMRC believe. They believe they are losing out to the tune of billions. And that's why Jeremy Hunt has said we are not repealing it because we need it. And IR35 is a particular piece of legislation which focuses on contractors who operate via limited companies. So if any of you have them in the room, you might have somebody who works for your business. It could be, I'll pick on IT because that's a typical example. Historically, a lot of highly talented IT professionals have set up limited companies. Absolutely fine if they've got an IT business, but sometimes what's happened is they've evolved into essentially becoming an employee. They work for one company or largely work for one company. And IR35 is all about you ensuring that you're not becoming a tax evader unwittingly, and the penalties for you as the employer are significant. If you take IR35 away, it's the contractor's problem. It's the contractor that's taking the risk. And if the contractor doesn't pay their taxes properly, HMRC will go after the contractor. But of course, HMRC don't want to be chasing the little contractor. They want to come after you because it's easier. You're an easier challenge. The ultimate irony is that in the last year, HMRC have fined the Home Office, who are sort of the corridor up from them, I think about 20 million. They've fined the Courts Department, the Courts and Tribunals, which includes the tax tribunals. They've fined them 15 million for not doing it correctly. So even within government, they haven't been doing it properly. The only thing that has probably saved a lot of private businesses in the last year or so is that HMRC's resources are still largely investigating furlough, fraud, bounce back related matters. They have a team on IR35, which I'm told is very small, but the investigators that are on furlough will be moving over to the IR35 team. So if you have concerns about it in your business, if you're using contractors and you're not really sure whether they should be contractors, then do come and talk to us. Thank you. Would someone else start to pick a bubble?
Holiday pay? Or is it?
That's for you.
Okay, I promise it's not going to be me answering all these. Can I explain the case of half a trustee rebel? Does everyone in the room, does that ring a bell with everybody? Lots of nods, and one shaking head. Okay. So, the summer of this year was it happens occasionally as employment lawyers, there's a case that just sort of creates utter panic and chaos. And this was one of them. The facts, very, very simply, is that Ms. Brazell was a music teacher working for a private school, and her hours were very, very irregular because it depended on whether there were any pupils that wanted private tuition in the instruments that she taught at a given time. So she only worked during term times, and even during term times her hours would fluctuate significantly. She is entitled to holiday pay, as all employees are, of course. And what the school did is what I would say the vast majority of employers would have done, which is simply look at what she was paid each month, and they added on 12.07% for her holiday pay. Many of you in the room will know why it's 12.07%. It's just the formula that a full-timer and their entitlement to 5.6 weeks holiday pay, just trust me, 12.07% is that number. So that's what they did. This particular individual didn't like that approach, took them to an employment tribunal, it went on appeal, it went on to the EAT, then it went to the Court of Appeal, it went to the Supreme Court. Lawyers dream in this case, millions of pounds are spent on legal fees. She was arguing about £313, and she won. and the principle is catastrophic for many employers on the face of it, because the Supreme Court have said you can no longer use 12.07% as a formula for calculating holiday pay for these types of workers, and I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. The 12.07 was never the law, the Supreme Court said. It was something that ACAS had recommended and the government had endorsed, but it was never actually the law, and you mustn't do it. You must pay people 5.6 weeks of holiday pay, not 12.07. And to illustrate the practical issue that this case causes, it's that imagine this hypothetical scenario. You have an employee, and none of you in the room will have this, I suspect, but it illustrates the point. You have an employee who works for you for 1 week a year, and let's keep the math simple. You pay that employee £1,000, and they work for you for 1 week a year. Under the 12.07 model, they would have had £120 and 70p holiday pay. The Supreme Court say, anyone brave enough to volunteer an answer? The Supreme Court say that employee should receive how much holiday pay? £5,600. Because their weekly pay is £1,000 and they should have 5.6 weeks of holiday. So they should get paid £5,600 of holiday pay for earning £1,000. Does that seem right to you? Utter bonkers. Absolute shambles. But the Supreme Court said that is the law, because the working time regulations, if anyone's sad enough to read it, simply say, essentially, that all employees who are permanent employees must receive 5.6 weeks of holiday pay. That's what the law says. So that individual who gets £1,000 a week, he's still entitled to 5.6 weeks of holiday pay, in essence. And the Supreme Court said that's the law, it's not for us to change it. If the government don't like the law, then they need to change the law. And I dare say the government might have considered doing that, but I'm told they've been quite busy dealing with other things. And so the issue for those of you in the room who have 0 hours employees, or as in this case, term time employees, if you're a school or you work in an industry that's related perhaps to seasons, this can be a real problem for you, because you shouldn't be paying, according to the Supreme Court, on the basis of 12.07. You should be taking an approach where you calculate what 5.6 weeks of pay is and average it out. Now, the practical advice we're giving clients is to not panic. Seems to be the theme of the morning so far. And do talk to us before you make drastic changes, because the law isn't always what everybody wants. We have one client who has a lot of 0 hours employees, and they essentially sat down with their sort of employee forum and said, at the moment we pay you 12.07% every month of the hours that you worked. What we're now going to have to do is not pay you that, and we're going to have to look at the end of the year and work out what 5.6 weeks of pay will be, and blah, blah, blah. The employees are up in arms. They want their 12.07%. You know, to stop paying that is like a huge pay cut for them in the middle of the cost of living crisis. And the employees are like, you don't touch that. We love our holiday pay. And so that particular employer has taken the view, we're going to do what our staff want, not what the Supreme Court is telling us. Controversial or otherwise, that's what they're doing. And actually, if your employees are happy and nobody's putting in grievances and nobody's suing you, it doesn't really matter what the Supreme Court say. If there isn't a claim, there isn't a problem. So pragmatism rules, and it's a big subject, but talk to us if it's a problem for you, because there's a real decision to be made as to how you want to deal with it. And at some point, don't know when, but at some point I suspect there will be legislation on it, because nobody can seriously think that it can be sensible, using that absurd scenario, that somebody who earns £1,000 a year is due £5,600 of holiday pay. That's a bit bonkers. Does anyone, I'm on this topic, I'm totally happy to take any questions on it. If anyone wants to ask any generic questions, please do. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk obviously in more specific detail afterwards. Does that explain what it's all about? Okay, great. I'm happy to move away from that. Okay. Somebody else pick the subject. Time off for dependence. Time off for dependence. Right, who should I throw this one to? I've had enough of my voice. I'm going to suggest Gareth.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan. This question was submitted about what point is an employee's level of time off for dependence considered unreasonable, and how are we best to deal with it? So, obviously, all employees have the right to time off for dependence. Now, dependent is categorised as a spouse, partner, child, grandchild, or a parent that someone depends on you to care for. Employees from day one have the right to time off to care for those dependents. Now, that has to be reasonable time off, and there's no length of service required for that right. It is unpaid, so I don't suspect you're going to suddenly get loads of requests for time off for dependents. It's not sick leave. It's that time to deal with an immediate crisis. So if there's an illness, injury, if you've got a child in school where there's an issue that you need to deal with, in an emergency situation, you have the right to ask your employer for unpaid time off to go and care for that dependent. Now, there is potential that could be abused by people, and we do see it on occasion, although not many people want to take lots of unpaid time off work, but there are situations where people do abuse that. Now, it is only there in emergency situations, so it's not to take time off for planned medical appointments, for half term, which is, school holidays are ones that we see quite regularly where people have got problems with childcare. Now, fair enough, day one, problem with childcare, an emergency situation has arisen, I need time off to sort that out. Day two, there's almost an expectation you should have sorted that out. It's no longer an emergency situation. So it's not a week off to care for an ill child. Day one may well be. So what we recommend to deal with these things, if you are struggling and you are having problems with people taking excessive amounts of time off to do this, again, I don't see it as a massive issue, because again, who wants to take lots of unpaid time off? But if you do have a situation, again, it's looking at having policies and procedures in place to make sure that you deal with things reasonably. Now, the problem is with lots of other scenarios where you've got people taking time off, so if they're off sick, you can put in place deadlines. You can have lines in the sand saying, if you go over a certain point or a certain number of days, we're going to look at it. You're off sick for 10 days, we're going to look at that and maybe sickness management. However, with time off for dependents, you can't just say, oh, once you've had 10 days off, that's too much and we're going to look at it. Actually, they are entitled to as much reasonable time off as they want. So we can't specify a time limit. However, what we could do is we could be very clear about how we manage that, having notification procedures in place. And again, if they're failing to notify you that the reason, or you can ask people to produce evidence of illness or what was going on, the emergent situation. Ask the question. Don't be scared to ask the employee the question. And also put in the policy, if people are abusing it, very much you can take disciplinary action against them. But you can't take action against somebody because they've genuinely exercised the right to time off for dependence. Hopefully that kind of deals with that question.
So, anyone else want to pick something?
Breakdown in relationship.
And what did I hear?
Breakdown in relationship.
Okay, well, we'll cover both of those then. Well, let's go for performance and management and mental health. Sarah, please.
So that's the question. How can employers manage performance for those suffering with mental health? The answer is honestly not that differently, much more differently, to managing performance for other staff. You just have to handle it sensitively. And the key to unlock all of that is medical advice. Mental health problems, obviously, you'll all know you can't see them, they all manifest themselves in different ways, and more we're seeing, well, the reason that my performance is poor, or I'm slow, or I'm forgetting things is because of my mental health. Whether or not we believe them, it doesn't really matter if you do. Step one is to get some medical advice so we can find out exactly what we're working with. So I would usually recommend sending them to occupational health rather than to a GP. GPs take forever. You're going to wait months and months and months for a report from a GP, whereas occupational health will turn it around much more quickly. And then you've got your medical advice. And if you've asked the right questions, it should tell you exactly what they can and cannot do and how their performance is impacted by their mental health condition. Then you use that report to essentially think about whether you can tweak their role, whether you need to adjust targets, whether you need to flex their hours slightly, if they struggle getting up, do you need to move them to later in the day. Set some expectations and set some goals along the parameters of what the medical advice tells you that person can do, and see if they can do it. And if they can't, you follow that lovely little circle, and you go round and round and round, and ultimately their performance improves, or you manage them out.
Oh, that's to the point.
Always.
One thing I would just add, I don't know if it's behind the question or not, but the phrase mental health has obviously become so much more known and used. Certainly when I started 20 years ago, I don't recall it being spoken about. It's now spoken about every single day. And so one of the challenges for employers is to not be cynical about it, but equally to understand that if someone texts you at 8 in the morning with a hangover and says, my mental health means I can't come to work today, that's not a mental health problem, that's a hangover. And we are starting to see clients saying to us that we're getting employees just thinking, if I drop the word mental health, it's like an excuse for everything. Sorry I didn't hit target, sorry I didn't come to work, it's my mental health. And I think you've got to make sure that you balance a really fair approach to somebody who has a genuine health issue with people that are just using the phrase because they think it's an excuse to get them out of a multitude of sins.
Can I just ask you a question? We've got somebody who is off at the moment with mental health issues, but when they were working with us, they were obviously suffering, so there's been a breakdown within their team because of the way they acted. How can we're trying to work out, was that because of their mental health, or was that because that's what they're like anyway? And so that you've got that breakdown, trying to bring them back into a workforce where their mental health might have made them react, be the behaviour that they were dealing with.
So do you want to take?
Yeah, of course. it now, I've got one. I think for me it genuinely does come back. The starting point would be get some opinion on how that mental health condition manifests itself, because that will help you work out whether it is actually they're just a difficult person to be around, or whether it is something connected with the condition they have. And I'm sure you've all had those occupational reports, you just look at them and you think, oh my God, this is no use to me whatsoever. It's all about asking the right questions genuinely, so those referrals are absolutely key. And again, you've paid for these reports, so if they're no help, it's go back to the occupational health provider and say, almost try again, these are the questions I answered you, I need to get the right answer. And then it's once you've got that, it helps you frame how that interacts with the workforce. And it might be mediation, it might be some tough love with the person who's got the mental health condition in line with the medical evidence, or it might be some tough love to their team if they're being mean to them or not understanding whatever it might be.
It's a compromise between the two and an understanding. So
Yeah, and the bottom line is that if someone has a mental health condition, it may or may not be a disability. So don't treat it any differently to any other health condition. In serious cases, it might be a disability. You might have a duty to make reasonable adjustments, but in many cases, it won't be a disability, and you won't actually have that legal duty. So it ought to be no different to any other health issue. But I think we're just seeing that everyone's really nervous about it at the moment.
I mean, he potentially might be an arrogant, bullying type.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is the case, but
No, I'm sure you're right.
he might have been that kind
But,
of person individually, but people are using that mental health.
That's why I made the point, and this is why I think it's a really difficult subject, because it's unfortunate for the people that have mental health issues that a cynicism we can see developing amongst employers, because it is being, I mean I joke with a hangover example, but generally I've seen people who are clearly just trying to slide off for the day, thinking if I say mental health, then that will get me home. I mean, they would have been better relying on Gareth's side and calling in on the emergency time off for dependents. But it's just not easy to say that, is it? Mental health's a lot easier. But yeah, it's something that we'll be talking about in more detail in the future seminars, I'm sure, because it's not going away as a challenge for us. And occupational health will have a real opportunity to be busy and make a lot of money if they can really help employers quickly identify what's a genuine mental health problem and what isn't. Okay, would anyone else like to pick anything that we've not talked about?
Can we have our breakdown in relationships?
Oh yes, that's true. Well, I was going to do that. Gareth, I'm going to throw that one back at you.
Thanks, Dan. So we get asked this question quite a lot. What happens when there are no performance issues, but the relationship with the employee breaks down? Well, if they've got less than 2 years, it's generally quite an easy answer to that question. However, if the employee has got more than 2 years service, as an employer, if you want to look at dismissing that employee or getting rid of them, you need a fair reason. And there are, broadly speaking, 4 fair reasons to dismiss an employee: conduct, capability, redundancy, or, as up on the board, SOSR, which stands for some other substantial reason. And it's a bit of a catch-all that you could potentially use in this type of situation where there has been a breakdown in relationships. I would just say be cautious with it. It's not a catch-all to go, oh, it's not conduct, not capability, not redundancy, great, SOSR, thanks very much, see you later. It has to be, as the name suggests, substantial. So it has to be a substantial reason. So as an employer, you need to try to rectify that relationship to make sure that it isn't, kind of completely broken. But if it is, there are grounds that we can use some other substantial reason to say, look, it's just not working. Before doing that, I would always suggest taking advice, because it is an area that we see a lot and it can be challenged, but you can use it. We can use that to dismiss employees. You can use it in a number of other circumstances. We talked about changing terms and conditions. Actually, another one that used to be a fair reason was retirement. No longer can you dismiss somebody for retirement. However, in certain industries we have compulsory retirement ages, and you now dismiss them for some other substantial reason. Another option if the relationship has broken down is to look at having a protected conversation. So a number of people will be aware in the room, Section 111A of the Employment Rights Act talks about the ability for employers to go and speak to their employees on a protected basis and say, it's not working. We need to come up with a way of resolving this, and a protected conversation can lead to possible settlement, often costs a little bit of money to exit the individual, but is an option to go down that road. You need to think about who would be best to do that. If there's a breakdown in relationships, it's not going to be the person who the relationship is broken down with the employee having that conversation. Probably doesn't end well. Might be you would, if you have HR, engage in them. If you don't, get in somebody as a HR specialist to come and have that conversation, or inviting the lawyers to have that conversation as well. But there are options that you can investigate.
Thanks, Gav. Yeah, I think sometimes we see clients who have what I call toxic employees. And toxic employees are usually very clever because they don't commit any gross misconduct. They're usually quite capable. You can't really make them redundant because what they do is vital. So the three reasons that employment law ordinarily gives you to dismiss don't sort of avail themselves. So SOSMA, as we love to call it, is an option, but fundamentally I say to many clients, it's irritating to get your checkbook out for this toxic employee, but more often than not, clients will come back to us afterwards and say it was the best money we spent. Because toxic employees lose you other employees, and we're in a market where you want to retain good people. And you lose good people often without realising it, because people often don't tell you in the exit interviews or at all that they left because of a toxic employee. So I would encourage you sometimes to just pay to get rid of them. And we'll help you mitigate that cost and try and make sure it's as low as possible, but it really can sometimes just be money well spent. We don't have any toxic people in the room, so who would like? We've got a bit of time. We're going to do the legal update in a moment, but I think we can certainly take another topic.
Let's do the good old menopause.
Menopause. I'm going to ask Harriet to talk about it. Harriet's our mental health expert and guru, so if you don't mind, Harriet.
Yeah, no problem at all. Can everyone hear me? Oh, gosh, I do like a microphone. Okay, so what are the key things to consider in relation to menopause in the workplace? Okay, so the interesting thing about this is that if you'd had this topic in a seminar maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, nobody would have been brave enough to select that. So in terms of the key considerations, the fact that we're talking about it is a great start. The reality is that it will affect, or may already be affecting, over 50% of your workforce. So it is worth giving consideration to, it is worth making sure it's on your HR agenda. It's not just women of a certain age. Menopause symptoms and perimenopause symptoms affect women as young as 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. The symptoms are wide-ranging, and the reality is that not only is it going to affect that large portion of your staff, the impact for you as a business can be quite significant because it's very wide-reaching. Menopause can affect performance, it can affect sickness absence, it can affect staff morale generally. I think there's a stat here, 45% of women say that they feel that their menopause symptoms have had a negative impact on their work. I mean, that's a shocking amount. And I suspect actually the reality is it's probably much higher than that in terms of the impact on work. So what can you guys do as businesses to try to improve that situation and to try to minimise the impact? Well, I guess the first point is the point I sort of started with, which is talking about it. I'm going to speak from personal experience to say that at Leeds Prior we have already started having the conversations. We've had a group session, we've got mentor sessions, we've got breakout sessions to start talking about the menopause. Both men and women came to those sessions. They were really, really productive. So I would encourage you all, if you haven't already, to start talking about it. Make it a phrase that is no longer stigmatised and is something that people talk about openly, because what it will mean, not just from a HR perspective, but for those individuals who are going through the menopause or the perimenopause, it will make them automatically feel like it's something that they can come to you for support for, which is absolutely crucial. Other things to think about are sort of more practical things to think about. So, do you want to have a written policy? We're not massive fans of having policies for absolutely everything, because you just end up getting tied up in knots, but this might be an occasion where you at least give some thought to whether a menopause policy is appropriate, or if not, you're having some sort of communication with your staff about the menopause, about the impact, about what you can do to support individuals who are going through that process. Again, sort of more practically, in terms of women who come to you and ask for support, consider flexibility in terms of hours, in terms of start times, finish times, being able to work from home or hybrid working. Consider things in the workplace. So really, really obvious one, a nice quiet room that staff can go to if they're having a moment, or showers in the office to make sure that if women need them, they're there. Having temperature control in your offices, all of those things that sound sort of really obvious, and they're actually really easy fixes, are all things that you can do to really start thinking about the menopause and how you can support staff going through it. But as I say, the fact that the question's been asked means that you're already on the right track.
Thank you, Harriet. Okay, I'm just going to suggest that the last topic I want to touch upon is 0 hours contracts. And we've heard this morning from Sarah that in planning for the possible, hopefully it won't impact any of your businesses, but if you do have an economic downturn in the next year or so, 0 hour contracts can be really useful in terms of managing your staff overhead. But I also touched upon in the Harper Trust case, 0 hour contracts do also bring a bit of a headache potentially in terms of holiday pay, and there's some issues there to think about. So we did have a question that came in from somebody, which was, what does good practice look like in relation to 0 hours contracts? Politically, it's quite an important topic. The Labour government have said that if they get in power, they want to legislate either against them or to certainly significantly restrict their use. The polar opposite a few weeks ago, when Mr. Rees-Mogg was knocking around, he was wanting to remove essentially any rights at all from 0 hours workers to encourage businesses to at least create jobs in a sort of a legal fear-free zone. But James, could you perhaps just talk about best practice?
Absolutely. Yeah, so they are obviously perhaps a little bit of a dirty word, as Sarah said, but there's definitely a place for them. And I think what it really comes down to overall is using them for the reason that they're intended, which is where you have an unpredictable workflow and you need that flexibility. And there's definitely workforce out there that want it. They want the flexibility. They want to be able to sort of work around their own commitments if they have care needs, etc., etc. So, what does best practice look like? Well, I think it is just about using them for what they're intended. So think about them. And I know that sounds maybe a little bit simple, but you'd be surprised. Don't just bring staff onto 0 hours contracts and then forget about them and find 6 years later you've got someone on, who's doing basically a full-time job who still has a 0 hours contract. Review the hours that they're working. So, are they working every Monday, Wednesday and Friday? Has that actually become the case now? And if so, if they do that for long enough, then obviously they're not really a 0 hours contract worker anymore. Give them a contract which reflects those hours. If you want a true 0 hours contract worker, you should probably vary the hours, vary the days that they work, in order to stop that from happening if you do want to kind of keep them on a flexible basis. But actually, probably reviewing their hours, I think, is beneficial for both parties. So you might rely on that member of staff to come in every Monday morning, and over the months, the years, that's what they've done. You actually want that certainty. So review their hours, and use the contract that's right for them. Is a 0 hours contract actually the right thing? And that's obviously good for the employee as well, because they get the certainty if that's what they want. So keep track of them. If you've got staff who aren't working, then sounds mean, but deal with them appropriately. Don't just leave them not working for weeks on end, months on end. What's the reason that they're not working, perhaps? Is it performance? If so, then, performance manage them. There's a common misconception that, 0 hours workers don't have any rights. Obviously, that's not true. If they've been working for 2 years or more, they have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, just like anyone else. So you do need to be, managing them appropriately. And actually, 0 hours workers, I think there's a stat, it's about at least 60% of them are essentially part-time workers. And if they're part-time workers, then they'll be covered by the part-time workers regs, so you can't treat them less favourably. So there's an obligation there on employers to actually deal with them how you would any normal full-time member of staff. And then finally, I think this one is obviously being touched on already. It's a minefield, and I'm not going to rehash Dan's an excellent analysis of the law. But holiday, obviously, holiday is a big one. I know lots of you will just use the 12.07%, roll up the holiday. Technically, it's not the law, so they should deserve to get their full 5.6 weeks allowance without having technically earned it, I suppose, if you think about it like that. Just be aware that they are now technically allowed to take their full 5.6 weeks.
Thanks, James. And that also neatly links back to the first topic I was asked to talk about, which was I-35, which is that what we are seeing occasionally is that people have self-employed contractors, and the justification for it is that the individual works as and when they feel like it, and it's very flexible. But of course, they might be a 0 hours employee. So if you're looking at self-employed contractors that you use, you do need to consider whether in reality this is a 0 hours employee, and that of course has the tax implications that goes with that. Okay, thank you speakers. I'm going to just now move on to the end of the session so we can finish on time, but you'll have plenty of time to, if you want to hang back and talk to any of us, you're more than welcome to do so. But we always end with the legal update, just covering a few things that are happening at the moment. I also tend to predict, usually with little success, what's coming next in the world of employment law. And as I said in the opening, it's been a very, very unpredictable and turbulent political period, which makes it very difficult to know what's coming. What strikes me as blindingly obvious, though, in the next 6 to 12 months, is that we are a country that will be impacted by ongoing strikes. Trade union activity is at an all-time high. I think you may have heard in the news yesterday, nurses have voted to strike, I think for the first time in their history. The nurses union have always said, we just won't strike, we can't do that, but they are. And that is only going to get worse because, linking back to what Sarah was talking about, on the one hand we have businesses saying, I've got to plan for the economic troubles that may be ahead, therefore pay rises next year are not going to be inflation busting or even close to inflation levels. That in turn will prompt more trade unions saying, hang on, why aren't you giving inflation level pay rises? Appreciate a lot of you in the room are not in unionised environments, so you may think we don't need to worry about trade unions or prospects of strikes. And on a small private business level, that may be true to an extent. However, what we are starting to see, and what I will predict, is that more and more employees are joining trade unions. I had one client that I spoke to this week. They only employ about 40 people, and they used to have one employee that they knew had joined a trade union, which they rather joked about. They now believe that 15 of their employees have joined this trade union. So suddenly they're eking up to 50% of their workforce. And that starts to become significant because trade unions may then try and assert certain rights over that business. So that's my sort of prediction. I think I'd encourage everybody to be more aware of that. Think about whether you want to have positive relationships with the trade union, when you don't, talk to us about it if it's something you need to know about more, because we can't ignore it. Over the next year or so, the trade unions are on a roundabout for members, and they are going to use the current climate to do that. Delightfully. Okay, legal update. There was a case recently which I think is very important as a bit of a reminder if you are going into an environment where you might be making redundancies. This claimant was a nurse working for the NHS on fixed-term contracts. Typically that can happen in the NHS on a series of contracts. This trust had financial problems. They wanted to reduce costs. And her fixed-term contract was coming to an end shortly. It was the first one to end. So they essentially called her to a meeting and said, look, you're a pool of one, your contract's coming to an end, and we're going to have to make you redundant, let you go. And they thought that was a very safe redundancy because her fixed-term contract was coming up anyway, and therefore that was fine. The EAT had said that was an unfair dismissal because the decision to put her in the redundancy pool on the basis that her contract was coming to an end was something that should have been subject to the consultation process, and that they had decided that before they started the consultation process, which effectively meant she had no chance to save her job, because it was already a fait accompli by the time they started consulting with her. And it's quite a key case because it's a reminder going into a climate where there may be more redundancies that consultation has to be genuine, and the employee has to have the opportunity, put it no higher than that, but they have to have the opportunity to save their job, or at least in some way mitigate the impact of a redundancy. We all know the reality is that when you start a redundancy process, you probably had a meeting with Sarah and you've probably got a flow chart and you've worked out all the colour codes of who's going when. But of course that is a preliminary view and you haven't prejudged anything. And what this case is a reminder is if you go into a consultation process with it being obvious what the outcome is going to be, that's almost certainly going to be an unfair dismissal. And I think it links back to a comment Gareth made, which is that in a period of boom where there's lots of jobs out there, employees don't tend, when they're made redundant, to bring unfair dismissal claims because they can walk into another job. In an environment, and I remember this certainly back in 2008, if you make redundancies and these people are not going to get another job, they are going to try and sue you if they can. So please be really careful about consultation and make sure it's meaningful. So touched upon unions and strikes as a big thing to be aware of. But also, on the flip side for employers, there's been a change in the law recently which says that if you do have a strike, and if you're in an industry where strikes may happen, you are allowed to use agency workers to come in and help you on a short-term basis. That until July of this year was illegal. You wouldn't be allowed to use agency workers during a strike. You now can if you are in that difficult scenario. And for the reasons I've just said, I think more businesses will find themselves unwittingly in a scenario where strikes could be a prospect. So this is one thing that does give employers a little bit more help. Unison have made it clear that they're taking the government to court over this law. They don't think it's lawful. They're going for judicial review. So we'll watch this space. There's going to be lots of developments in the government versus trade union wars over the next 6 to 12 months. The government are looking at other things they can do to reduce what they see as a unattractive power that the trade unions are having, and they're looking at all sorts of things, including whether if somebody joins a trade union, they don't get any voting rights for a certain period of time to sort of stop people joining and then trying to vote for a strike tomorrow, and things like that. So watch this space. So another thing to be aware of, has anyone heard of social prescribing? Oh, good. 'Cause I hadn't until recently. So this is quite interesting. So we now have NHS launching this scheme, and it seems to be something they're designing really with young people in mind, though it equally can apply anywhere at all. And what it essentially says is that GPs can give a prescription that somebody should pursue a certain social activity. So, for example, there's been a trial going through where youngsters who are exhibiting like mental health problems, any sort of health issues, they're actually prescribing them to take part in sport, or prescribing them to go to more gigs. Imagine that. Imagine going to a doctor and being told, damn, what you need to do is go to the O2 and see Pearl Jam. Wow. All quite cool when you think about it. But as an employer, we think this is something that is going to probably take off, because the GPs are under pressure to come up with solutions and prescriptions that don't cost them money. And I think there's a view, rightly or wrongly, I don't have a medical view on this, but there's a view, for example, that GPs have been too quick to prescribe, whether it be antidepressants, whether it be medication, and that actually they're going to be encouraged to give people a social prescription. Why are we talking about this? We see lots of implications. The classic call I had is actually a few weeks ago. Dan, my employee's off sick. I've just been shown an Instagram post. She's in Ibiza this weekend, partying, but she's off sick. So it's okay, what's she off sick with? She's got stress and depression. She's not supposed to be working. Was this a work day? Well, no, it's a Saturday. She's gone on a hen do to Ibiza. Can we sack her? She's clearly not sick. Doesn't follow that because you're sick, you can't necessarily go on a hen party to Ibiza, but one can understand why the employer is a little bit dubious. This will become even more complicated because we now may have a scenario where the employee who is off sick with stress, for example, may be told that they should socially be prescribed fun. You need to have lots of fun, you need to party, you need to go to Ibiza, you need to play golf. You know, I'm going to ask to be prescribed more red wine. Amazing. As an employer, you're going to need to therefore be a bit open-minded, and we need to just be aware of it because employees who are savvy, of course, might try and lead their GPs into getting a social prescription. So it's quite interesting. I thought I'd mention it. It's an evolving topic, and it's something that we'll need to keep an eye on. Twitter. Anyone here a Twitter user? Well, lots of interesting things been going on in the legal world. Largely reported what's happened in America. I'm sure you saw last Friday, Elon Musk decided that at least half of the workforce at Twitter would be fired. My understanding is that last Friday, if you worked for Twitter, you logged in and you found that you could no longer log in, or you could log in and you were basically told that you still had a job. Now, that's not a recommended way of firing people, locking them out of the systems. It does remind me of a case I dealt with many years ago where my client set the fire alarm off, got everyone out in the car park, changed the locks, and then only gave a new key to the people that weren't getting fired. This is kind of a modern day equivalent of that, isn't it? So just kicking them out of the IT systems. Not a recommended way to do it. In America, employment law is very different. But what is interesting is that Twitter does also employ a lot of people in London, and they took a slightly different approach in the UK because of employment law. They're not radically. What they did on Friday is tell all the UK employees, you're all at risk of redundancy, half of you are going to go basically, but you need to elect representatives, because I'm sure most of you will know if you have large scale redundancies under UK law, you've got to consult with elected reps. So they were told on Friday to have a think about who they wanted their reps to be and to let them know by Monday because they were starting consultation on Monday with the reps. So they've tried to put together a sort of a quasi-fair process. You can imagine some poor employment lawyer in London was probably on the phone to Elon Musk trying to persuade him that he needs to consult. Imagine how that conversation went. What? We're going to consult? Reps? So apparently they are now consulting with reps. One suspects there'll be lots of claims there. In fact, we need to get to London and pick up all these Twitter employees. Because I suspect Elon Musk will have the means to settle those claims. It'll be quite interesting. So yes, just a good lesson. Please don't lock people out of the IT systems before you've started the consultation process, and certainly don't fire them in that way. That's not a good idea. Though if you do, it will be lots of work for us. So that's okay as well. Great, guys. We're on time. Thank you all for coming. We're all going to stay back. Primarily to drink coffee. So if you'd like to have a chat with us on anything, please do. If you need to get back to work, do. If you can fill in the feedback forms, that would be helpful. Let us know if you like the new venue. The next seminar will be our 10th one, so we're going to try and make that super special. Hopefully it was just helpful today to touch upon a few sort of topics that you wanted to talk about. So, thank you. Have a good one.